So how's the battery life on the Evolve laptop? You might be as shocked as I was. Stick around and we'll get right to it. Real quick before we get going today, I've got to give a shout out to these guys. They're my latest patrons over on Patreon. If you'd like to help support the channel, I'll leave a link to Patreon down in the description below. Now there's already been a lot of channels doing a video on this Evolve laptop, and I saw a ton of these things in Huntsville. Josh from HRCC has already used this laptop in a few of his live streams, and he's running Windows. Temporarily Offline has already proved that we could load and use Linux on this laptop. So I'm not going to focus on either one of those today. What I want to look at is the battery life of this laptop, because I was really surprised with the battery consumption of this device. So one of the first things I did is I ran the battery completely flat, all the way down to 0%, and then connected it up to a 12-volt source and measured how much amperage it would take to recharge that battery. And my testing showed that it took right around 3 amp hours from a 12-volt source to fully charge the laptop's internal battery. Now, during that test, I did make sure that the screen was off. In fact, the laptop was completely powered down, and it was taking roughly 1 amp per hour as the charge started, and as it got closer to being full, that obviously started to drop down until it reached 100%. Now, once it was at 100%, I went ahead and fired up the laptop, and I opened up both JS8 Call and FL Digi, trying to just exercise that CPU a little bit, and the CPU was averaging about 30%. Now, when it was averaging about 30%, the screen was on and set at roughly 50% brightness. I was seeing that the laptop was consuming around 450 milliamps from a 12-volt source. So with a little bit of math, we can gather, remember it took 3 amp hours to charge it, we're getting about 450 milliamps of consumption. We'll call that 500 so it's easier math for me to do on camera. That's going to give us right around 6 hours of runtime from that battery just for the computer. Now, if we couple the laptop with a radio such as the 705, combined, the laptop and the radio, we are only using about 750 milliamps of power, or consuming 750 milliamps of power from a 12-volt source during receive. Now, that's not going to take into transmit. Obviously, our numbers are going to go up. But I was just wanting to look at consumption of the laptop while it had a little bit of a load on the processor, and then how much more would the consumption of the radio add to that equation. But with those two devices, let's assume that you've got a 10 amp hour battery. You could run both devices, again, receive only, for roughly 13 hours. Yeah, that's 13 hours of runtime from a 10 amp hour battery. Now that 13 hours assumes no transmitting, that's receive only, but it also assumes that you have no solar input to help recharge the battery. What would it look like if we connected up, let's say, a PowerFilm 30-watt solar panel? Well, I know from previous testing that that solar panel is going to generate roughly 1 amp every hour that I can put back into the battery. So I would be gaining roughly 250 milliamps per hour if the radio and the computer were sitting there in receive. Now, if we go to something like the 60-watt top solar panel, that panel is going to give us, now assuming good sun, we're going to get about 2 amps out of that solar panel every hour. So with this laptop and a radio, we could be sitting there running both of them in a receive and getting approximately 1.25 amps back into the battery. Now, if you really wanted to go crazy, let's talk about using this setup with a 100 amp hour battery in my RV. That would give us 133 hours of runtime, or about 5.5 days running this setup around the clock. Guys, I tell you what, I am absolutely blown away at how little current this laptop consumes when we're running it. And I wasn't just letting it sit there idle. I actually had it under a load running both JS8 Call and FL Digi using about 30% of the processor. Now, we will be taking a look at comparing this laptop to a Raspberry Pi 4 in an upcoming video. But I tell you, from a power standpoint, holy cow, does this thing use very little power. So I definitely think this is a contender for a field computer to be used for our digital modes. We'll see you guys on the next one. Until then, 7-3.